Thank you very much. I'm really delighted to be giving this lecture and offer what will probably be a fairly different perspective to what you have heard in this lecture series so far, since I am a humanist. So I begin with the question, what could the humanities possibly have to offer as far as solutions for climate change? This is the question I've been asking myself for at least 10 years. And incidentally, during that same period, general public awareness of the crisis has, of course, grown, while universities in the US and elsewhere have placed ever more emphasis on the STEM fields, science, technology, engineering, and math, and on the practical. When we humanists are invited to the table, in my experience, we are often viewed as either artists. You can create works of art, my colleagues have told me, to raise awareness of what is happening and to appeal to emotions. Or we're sometimes viewed as good journalists. You can help translate our difficult science into legible prose in order to get people to act. Or sometimes we're seen as soft social scientists or behaviorists. You can explain why people act the way they do and then help get them to change. Well, this is not at all what I was trained to do and not at all what I'm interested in doing. But for example, at a recent colloquium at Yale University, scientists agreed that the humanities could serve to bridge gaps between the science of climate change with all of its built-in uncertainties to a broader public because, quote, an effective message must create an emotional connection for the audience. And we shouldn't forget that this position paper from the Sackler Institute comes at a time of great crisis in the humanities, with low enrollments and severe funding cuts, and at a time when around half of the students entering university in the US declare engineering as their preferred field of study. That doesn't mean that half of them will end up graduating with a degree, but that's what they think they want to do. So in contrast, I argue for the impractical humanities, for thinking about anthropogenic climate change as something quite unique, not just another environmental issue, and not one that we can solve with greener technology inserted into old paradigms or cleaner fuels inserted into old infrastructures. And not one that we can solve, at least not in the sense of those other disciplines, but rather one that requires us to think radically and imaginatively. So as I've suggested, the public sphere seems to be concerned with the conservation efforts of the individual consumer. Conservation is presented as a possibly pleasurable ethical choice, even when the consumer should be savvy or even skeptical about the rhetorical mechanisms of green marketing or greenwashing. The focus on the individual markedly works to divert attention, I think, from the larger issues of manufacturing, agriculture, or local or national policies that contribute significantly to greenhouse gas emissions. In other words, the consumer-based model of responsibility both strengthens the very foundations of neoliberalist market practices and simultaneously helps to defer discussion of the much broader and deeper changes that will be needed on a global scale in order to achieve reduction in greenhouse gas emissions, slow the destruction of biodiversity, and so on. So I think we have a lot of signifiers floating around, as we literary scholars would say. Just walk through the airport and you will see advertisements. And maybe for the general public, they can walk past them and either ignore them, or perhaps the advertisers tell us some subconscious mechanism will register with them But as a literary scholar, you are trained to read advertisements. And then the question is how to read advertisements. The extreme North American drought of the summer of 2012 brought climate change to the forefront of U.S. public attention with greater force than any other time, with the possible exception of 10 years ago after the release of Al Gore in An Inconvenient Truth. But in contrast, the mainstream media did report widely on the records broken by the extreme heat and aridity. But how did they report? So, for example, Wolf Blitzer, a very important news anchor for CNN, discussed the drought with a meteorologist, repeating that July 2012 was the single hottest and driest month on record, average temperature 25.3 degrees Celsius, since 1936. In addition, so far, 2012 has been the warmest year on record overall. But when he tried to reconcile the two, the fact that temperatures were heating up in an apparently linear fashion, with the fact that a previous drought record was some 80 years ago, practically ancient history in terms of mediatic real time, he became very flustered. This is Wolf Blitzer. I mean, he really did not seem to know quite what to do. Could the drought and the heat be directly attributed to climate change? Why was the meteorologist reluctant to make that simple absolute statement? But the segment was cut short, mercifully, Blitzer probably thought, for a commercial break. And incidentally, I was watching this on television in my home state of New York, where a good number of the commercials shown in my viewing area, Central New York, an area that sits atop the northern part of the Marcellus Shale, where shale gas has been removed from the ground through fracking in the Pennsylvania part of the shale, but so far not in New York State. These commercials are equally confusing as they utter what are apparently linked signifiers: clean natural gas, patriotism, American jobs, and energy independence. The viewer who was only casually paying attention to CNN might have heard another series of signifiers as well: drought, heat, records broken, climate change, but would have lacked any context in which to place them. Of course, climate change bears a name that is as old as the Earth itself, a name that belongs, however, to geological time rather than to human time. Anthropogenic climate change represents an unfathomable speeding up of processes that are in and of themselves entirely natural, as are fossil fuels. Deep time cannot be grasped with the can-do attitude of the engineer. It is something simply beyond our comprehension. For example, one question that I have asked myself a lot is, what happens when the clock hand goes beyond 12? Where will we be? Who will be there to watch it going beyond 12? What would signify the next hour of geological time? So we have made things like this, or graphs like this, in order to try to represent something that we can prove through science, but we do not have the tools to actually understand it. So a great deal of my own work has been about renouncing our ability to understand in the face of the enormity of the geological clock. Some call this nihilism. My scientists, though, ask me for hope. And then the practical tugs at me like a stubborn dog on the leash. How can we consider something like the stabilization wedges of Pakala and Sokolo with anything but a sense of hope? This is a scheme that amortizes and diversifies forms of sacrifice over time, but using actual present technologies. There's no futuristic element to this. It seems so compelling. So why aren't we following their scheme now, or in the near-term past or future? But I must say that for me, hope is a very ambivalent and excessive term that should resist being molded to conform to energy policy, regulatory schemes, however progressive these might be, or subsidies for the promotion of certain forms of fuel over others. Actions such as carbon trading schemes, reducing pollution from existing power plants, or raising emission standards for cars, if these are feasible, even if these are feasible goals to attain in the current climate, none of these modes are adequate to hope, which for me could only be reached by a gesture precisely of rhetorical violence. Whatever else it might mean, hope certainly requires a leap of imagination, a way of thinking otherwise about the future. I've been thinking lately that an anthropologist called Hiro Makazaki has put forward a useful paradigm. He has suggested that hope might constitute something like a method, as inspired by Walter Benjamin's notion of messianic history, seizing hold of memory as it flashes up at a moment of danger. Benjamin writes, "Only the historian will have the gift of fanning the spark of hope in the past, who is firmly convinced that even the dead will not be safe from the enemy if he wins." It's a sort of scrambling of time, scrambling of our brains about thinking about time. The materialist historian must be ever vigilant against the enemy. A spark of hope is ignited by radical temporal orientation. For Miyazaki, what is crucial is that the courageous historian carves out a space for hope by changing the character of the direction of historical knowledge. He applies this notion to the field work that he did as a method. So he worked with the Suvavu people, and he wrote that the sparks of hope that have flown up from my encounter with these people, mostly products of incongruities between the temporal direction of my own anthropological intervention and that of the Suvavu's people's hope. Such a method must resist an immediate demand of hope for synchronicity, but must instead find hope precisely in non-synchronicity. I find this very compelling. We must travel back before the label Anthropocene was in circulation, whether we take this term to refer to the beginning of industrialization. So some people would say the final patent of Watt's steam engine is sort of the moment when the Anthropocene begins. Or, as has been said more recently, the mid-20th century with the detection of radium and plastics in the atmosphere and in the earth. or has been suggested even very recently by the stratigraphic research group, the precise year of 1610, the lowest point in a decades-long decrease in atmospheric carbon dioxide, caused precisely, and this was measured in Arctic ice cores, and they think that this decrease was caused precisely in, as the British scientists Lewis and Maslin argue in the journal Nature, by the death of over 50 million indigenous residents of the Americas in the first century after European contact, so the result of exposure to diseases carried by the Europeans, and war, enslavement, and famine. But long before this discussion about the Anthropocene, Walter Benjamin understood that non-synchronicity was not simply based on human actions, but was also a disjunction between human time and geological time when he wrote, "The present, which is, as a model of messianic time, comprises the entire history of mankind in an enormous abridgment, and this coincides exactly with the stature which the history of mankind had in the universe." In our very recent past, a past that has been rendered more distant than it might have been due to the sped-up temporality of the Anthropocene, some held out hope that hydrogen would exist not only as a commodity, but as a shared resource, an energetic commons. It would be so not because of some cataclysmic shift, but because it would be so easy to generate and distribute without meters, without infrastructure or grids. But perhaps more importantly, we will have had no before and no after climate change. I'm using a very strange verbal construction to think about the temporality we live in. We will have had no return. There will be no threshold to mark the distinction between the past and future in which humanity can finally redeem itself. Although, for example, this is the structure that Roland Emmerich tries to reproduce in the Hollywood film The Day After Tomorrow. Rather, we face an erosion, which in geological terms may be unbelievably fast, but which in human terms seems slow. In geological terms, we should never be able to witness such erosion as it happens, not only beyond the boundaries of our individual lifespans, but beyond the boundaries of our recording technologies. However, for us today, even decades seem slow, and this is something only the humanities, only thought around what it means to narrativize, to think time and being, can actually contract in all of its unfathomability. Thank you.